Luck for Luck campaign and a ticket raffle on a Harley-Davidson motorcycle are just some of the 5 yearly projects Mark Pound oversees to support the charity. Mr. Speaker, it is with pride that I congratulate Mark Pound on his well-deserved recognition and award. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm calling on the Community Services Minister to clarify a statement she made suggesting the Liberal government will continue to freeze income assistance. When questioned by CBC about whether any increases will take place while the minister finishes her review of the income assistance program, the minister was quoted as saying, "We're not looking at incremental changes." Mr. Speaker, a freeze in social assistance rates is actually a cut. In the past 2 years, the cost of living in Nova Scotia has gone up almost 3%, yet the minister has refused to help income assistance recipients bridge
Order,
that
please.
gap.
We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Today, many Nova Scotians awoke to the news that the IWK is overwhelmed by the number of children seeking mental health treatment, Mr. Speaker. This fact became only too real when we heard the story of a dad whose son could only get the help he needed after an attempt on his own life. Mr. Speaker, too many young Nova Scotians are going without mental health treatment in this province. I'd like to ask the Premier, will he now agree that there is a crisis in mental health delivery in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. At any one point in time, there can be the challenge of an individual not being able to access a service across the province. In terms of the IWK, those who are in trauma and in crisis, as we know from the IWK staff today, that they do get those patients in, and the Garand Centre is set up to be able to give that kind of treatment.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wish this was just one point in time, but this is not one point in time. It's an ongoing issue. The staff at the IWK are overwhelmed by the demand for mental health services. They're asked to hit a standard of 30 days in response to a young person who presents themselves in need of mental health diagnosis and treatment, Mr. Speaker, but their own wait lists show that young people are waiting on average 70 to 90 days, almost 3 times the standard that we set for the IWK, Mr. Speaker. It is not just a point in time. It is an ongoing issue. It is a crisis. I'd like to ask the Premier, in light of this ongoing crisis, will he now agree to call a public inquiry into the state of our mental health system?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure him the Minister of Health is continuing to work with our partners across, not only at the IWK, Mr. Speaker, but across the province. The investments we made in Schools Plus program, to early intervention, the investments we're making in mental health programs across the province. Is there more work to do? Of course there is, Mr. Speaker, but we're going to continue to partner with our partners to ensure that Nova Scotia families get the health care when they need it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier can quote budgets and facts and figures all he wants, but the staff at the IWK have been very clear. They are overwhelmed by the demand. Will be measured not by the amount of money spent alone, but whether people get the help that they need. And the fact of the matter is that the government is following a physician resource plan, which actually calls for a reduction in the number of adolescent psychiatrists in the province, Mr. Speaker. They're overwhelmed at the current amount. In the last 3 years, we've gone from 17 to 15.5, and further reductions are planned by the government under its own plan. Mr. Speaker, if I could quote from the independent review that was done, a reduction in those psychologists will adversely affect access to child and adolescent care in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier at least agree to set aside his physician resource plan and start adding to the resource of adolescent psychiatrists instead of cutting them?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I know is that over the past 4 years, since the previous government brought in Together We Can strategy, we have dramatically reduced the wait time for assessment. What the question is around assessment, yes, the benchmark of 30 days is what we would like to achieve and are working towards. We once had a wait list in this province of 975 waiting to be assessed. We have dramatically improved that, and we are moving services across the province to meet adolescent mental health needs, and we will continue to do so.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question for you is to the Premier. During the last election, the Premier in his platform promised that reducing the number of district health authorities would lead to greater investment in frontline health care, and unfortunately, 2 years into the Liberal government's mandate, the opposite has happened. The health care budget has been frozen, wait times and ER closures are on the rise. There's a moratorium in long-term care, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we found out the province has spent $9 million on the restructuring. So my question for the Premier, why has he failed to keep his promise to invest more resources into frontline health care?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure her, as I travel this province, that Nova Scotians continually respond to the fact that we have torn down the barriers that have existed in this province for far too long when it comes to delivery of health care. Reducing the administration, Mr. Speaker, will continue to work to reduce the wait times across this province. At the same time, we're trying to grow the economy, so, Mr. Speaker, we can have more money to ensure that we invest in the services that Nova Scotians expect to have in the province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP caucus has obtained the minutes from the June 25th board meeting of the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And in these minutes, it is revealed that the Chief Financial Officer has reviewed the fiscal situation of the Health Authority, and I quote, "The current projected deficit will have mitigations applied to decrease the deficit over time." Mr. Speaker, in the Health Authority business plan released just 3 weeks prior to that meeting, no mention was made of a budget deficit. So my question for the Premier is this: can he please tell this House what the projected deficit was for the Nova Scotia Health Authority the day of that meeting?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that'd be a good question for the Health Authority.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm shocked that the Premier is unaware. He made many promises about the savings they were going to have setting up this entity during the election, but now that it's set up, he has no idea what's happening with their budget. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, in the same meeting, it stated that the CFO of the Health Authority is meeting with staff around the province, delivering a message that they have to meet their financial targets. And, Mr. Speaker, health cuts are on the way. So my question for the Premier is this: can he please inform this House what mitigations or cuts are being discussed with healthcare providers across the province to ensure the board of the Health Authority meets its financial targets?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I'm surprised the former finance minister doesn't realize how things work, but then again, just all we have to do is look back at the 4 years when the year she was the finance minister. We gave a budget to the Health Authority, Mr. Speaker. We expect them to live within that budget. If there are issues coming from the Health Authority, they'll come back, look for more money, Mr. Speaker, look for a way to deliver that services, but we expect them to deliver within the budget that we've given them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of budgets, it was only through a Freedom of Information request yesterday that Nova Scotians learned the true cost of merging the health authorities, and that it's actually $3 million more than the government had admitted up to that point. Mr. Speaker, in fact, that Freedom of Information request makes clear that the government did not include the cost of merging the IT systems of the previous health authorities. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, when was his government planning to tell Nova Scotians the true cost of merging the health authorities?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to speak to the merger. In fact, the costs that were presented That money for the IT was included in 14-15 budget year, and a great deal of it, of course, was going to be used to update the 9 systems. What we did, however, was take that money and some additional money to have one system, which is already leading. That investment is leading to substantial savings just on the procurement alone.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is, right up until yesterday, the government was telling Nova Scotians the cost of the merger was $5.7 million. Now we know it's $9 million, and who knows what else they're not counting, Mr. Speaker. They didn't tell Nova Scotians about this $3 million extra cost. They had plenty of time to do that. It was only when a Freedom of Information request came forward did the government finally come clean about how much they were spending merging the health authorities. So I'd like to ask the Premier a simple question. Why wasn't the government just upfront with Nova Scotians in the first place about the cost of merging the health authorities?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the honourable member this government has been upfront with Nova Scotians and they've responded in such a positive way, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to see them join us not only as we streamline the administration of health care, but we create jobs from one end of this province to the other, Mr. Speaker, to grow the economy, to invest in education, to invest, Mr. Speaker, in health care, to ensure that vulnerable citizens in this province get the programs that they need, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to continue to work with Nova Scotians despite what the Leader of the Conservative Party says.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. In the Nova Scotia Health Authority minute meetings from June, the Chief Financial Officer stated that he has been meeting with staff across the province, delivering the message that the board is serious about meeting the targets to reduce the deficit. We've been advised that the Health Authority has been asked to find a 1% reduction in their budgets by the year end, regardless of whether that department is in mental health and addiction or diagnostic imaging. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister advise us if these 1% budget cut reductions are across the board or are they targeted within the healthcare sector?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can convey to the honourable member and all Nova Scotians is that the new Provincial Health Authority is indeed finding many inefficiencies in the system when we have the 9 separate districts, and as an ongoing way of saving money and getting it to frontline health care. This will be a global look at all the budget items that are within the Nova Scotia Health Authority purview.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, one can only imagine what $9 million would do to support and improve healthcare delivery here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Our caucus has been told that managers have been asked not to hire replacements when vacancies arise. So I'm wondering if the Minister could tell us how many vacancies there are in each zone of the new Health Super Board.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the honourable member is that on a per capita basis, our merger was just really a shadow of what took place in Alberta and New Brunswick. We have done a very, very cost-effective way of starting up one new health authority, and the savings to Nova Scotians and the improvement in the quality and standard of care will also improve.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, a review of the Involuntary Psychiatric Treatment Act was released, containing 101 recommendations. The purpose of that review, required under the Act, is to make sure that the legislation is meeting the objectives or not, and to recommend changes to strengthen it. 2 years later, there's no sign that the government has any plan to implement change that are needed to improve the care that people receive. So my question to the Minister of Health is, why has the Minister been dragging his feet on making improvements to the mental health care for patients in need?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the former health minister for that question. We know that mental health issues are in fact a concern to all Nova Scotians. We know that incremental improvements, especially in providing rural areas of Nova Scotia with mental health clinicians to reduce wait times. In fact, in two of the zones, we've made considerable improvements. Those areas of the Psychiatric Act that the member is referring to, I can provide him during this session with an update on the number of those recommendations that are moving forward.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're halfway through the 5-year mental health strategy, and the reality is the services are not meeting the needs of people. Nova Scotians are crying out for attention from the government on mental health issues, and the failure to implement important changes to the Involuntary Psychiatric Treatment Act is indicative of this government's complacency on mental health issues. It's another good example of important research and policy initiatives that are gathering dust on many shelves in government. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister commit to introducing changes to the Involuntary Psychiatric Treatment Act this session?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can convey to the member and all Nova Scotians is that when these recommendations came forward, some of them started into the system immediately. I've had an update on where we are. It's a huge number of recommendations that came forward, and during this session, I can provide the member with an update on where those recommendations currently are.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Changing gears a little bit, last week in the Legislature, the Minister of Community Services, told the House how proud she was of the work she was doing with the Aboriginal community on changes to the Children and Family Services Act. She specifically quoted her work with Chief Prosper and Chief Deborah Robinson. And during the Standing Committee on Law Amendments yesterday, Chief Prosper told the committee that there had not been adequate consultation with First Nations, and he really wasn't engaged from the beginning. So my question to the Minister of Community Services, can she explain how consultations that she was so proud of last week will be viewed as inadequate from the very people she was supposed to be consulting with?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 23% of the children that are in care in Nova Scotia are Aboriginal. It would be not in anyone's best interest not to engage the Aboriginal community. That consultation started in December of 2014, which was actually even before we reached out to the staff in our own department. Since that time, I've personally met with Chief Prosper and Chief Robinson twice. I haven't met with any other stakeholder. I also had given my word on the regulatory process that they would be involved in the development of that, and also provided funding to hire an Aboriginal lawyer, in which we now have a report that we've never had before in Nova Scotia. So yes, I'm still proud of the 24 amendments that came out of the consultations that happened from December until last month that affect the Child and Family Services Act.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, we also found yesterday, not only had the consultation been a little lax with the First Nations community, that one of the last witness to law amendments yesterday, Professor Rolly Thompson, has said that he had been given plenty of time to talk during consultations, but he didn't believe his comments had been heard. So what is the purpose of consultations if the minister is not going to listen to the people who take time to give their opinions?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the way that we rolled out the amendments to the Child and Family Services Act. I would like to remind everyone in this House that there were 15 years and 8 reports of consultations. The last speaker yesterday was the original author of the report and has repeatedly said that he doesn't believe there should be any amendments to this Act. I'm very, very pleased with the 24 amendments that came out for the Aboriginal community. I'm very pleased with the 25 meetings we had with 37 stakeholders over the last 6 months. This bill is too important not to consult with the community, and I would never, in all good conscience, this not consult with the very people in the community that this bill will affect in the care of children.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the province of New Brunswick announced they are ready and able to resettle up to 1,500 Syrian refugees to assist the federal government with their plan to settle 25,000 by the end of next month. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Immigration has expressed her willingness to resettle Syrian refugees but has not outlined specifics of the government's plan. Mr. Speaker, our province is the only one that has not yet announced any targets or any numbers for how many refugees we can accept in this effort. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, can the Premier please outline how many Syrian refugees have we targeted to resettle by the end of this year?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I also want to thank the Minister of Immigration, who's been doing a tremendous job on behalf of all Nova Scotians. Reaching out across our province, Mr. Speaker, responding to our partners and communities who have acknowledged and said they'll play a role in ensuring that any refugees that come in this province help them settling in communities. We're seeing Nova Scotians themselves step up, volunteering. Today, the Minister announced the 211 where a portal where we'll gather all of the information. Next Monday, I meet with the Prime Minister and the other premiers to talk about the refugee status, where the federal government is to bringing people into the country, Mr. Speaker, what the security pieces will be around that, and we'll continue to have that conversation as we go forward.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, with a standalone department and a minister dedicated to one department only, I would have thought that there would have been ample time to do some planning, and we would have at least the same amount of planning in place as what other provinces seem to have. Yet we are the only province that has not established targets. And there are many organizations in Nova Scotia who are anxious to know what it is that we are planning. So, Mr. Speaker, my last question to the Premier is, could the Premier detail what conversations our government has had with the federal government on safely resettling Syrian refugees in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, the Minister of Immigration has had numerous conversations with our federal colleagues to go forward. I don't know how the leader of the New Democratic Party would have any understanding what other provinces have done in terms of preparing to welcome refugees into the province. Because a province throws out a number doesn't mean they've done anything in the due diligence. Let me assure all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Immigration in this province has been working in building relationships across this province so that when we accept the number of refugees, Mr. Speaker, that we will take in as part of the Federation of Canada, not only will we accept them, but we'll accept them in a safe way that will allow them to settle into our province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. In the fall of 2013, the Premier visited departments to talk about his plans for the new government. He told staff and spoke to staff, at least some staff, about the fact that he had issued mandate letters to his ministers to carry out his direction. This is a common and sensible approach. Mr. Speaker, since the original mandate letters, has the Premier advised members of Cabinet of any new or updated mandates, either through letters or other means?
The Honourable Premier.
Yes.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week we saw that Prime Minister Trudeau publicly released the mandate letters of his cabinet so Canadians could see exactly what the priorities of his government would be. This has been widely hailed as an important show of transparency in government. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier publicly release the 2013 mandate letters he issued, and as well as the additional ones, I guess, that he just referred to?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the honourable member and all Nova Scotians that the mandate letters delivered to the members of the Executive Council were based on the platform that we ran on. I'm very proud of the fact that we are delivering on what we told Nova Scotians we would deliver on.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. Mr. Speaker, despite repeated assurances from the Minister that his department has strong financial oversight in place for the Nova Star ferry, it turns out that they owe more than $2 million to their suppliers. Today we learned that $200,000 of unpaid the unpaid bills were to Nova Scotia companies. Nova Scotians support a ferry service but are concerned about mounting taxpayer bills. Clearly, this minister's strong financial oversight has failed. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the minister is this: has the minister given Nova Star a deadline to pay its Nova Scotia suppliers, and if so, what is it?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Quite the contrary with respect to financial oversight. The agreement that we had in place for 2015 was $13 million. We followed every penny of that $13 million by way of monthly cash flows that we asked for, that we requested, and that we were very diligent in looking through. We satisfied our end of the arrangement. The $13 million was paid. The 2015 season did operate under Nova Star. Obviously, we have a new direction with Bay Ferries for 2016, one that we're looking forward to. But with respect to Nova Star and its creditors, Mr. Speaker, we participate in agreements, and we have arrangements with businesses all across this province, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, they have business decisions to make. We don't make those decisions for them. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North on his final supplementary.
I'd like to thank the minister for that answer. Given that a $200,000 bill or part of it owing to a small business could cause a Nova Scotia to go bankrupt, I would like to ask the minister, and given that this ferry was financed with Nova Scotia taxpayers' money, can the minister please tell Nova Scotians what steps he did take to ensure Nova Star would pay its bills to Nova Scotia companies?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Again, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Nova Star, they had obligations as part of their arrangement with the Government of Nova Scotia and, of course, with the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the cash flows we were provided that we looked through, which were the basis of our disbursements at the end of every month here for the 2015 operating season, was based on the general information we had on the cash flows. We don't get into creditors, Mr. Speaker. That's not our place. We don't operate the affairs of small business or any business, any operation for them, Mr. Speaker. The decisions that were made were on behalf of Nova Star, their company, their entity. We made protections in place on behalf of the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. We lived up to our agreement for 2015, and we're looking forward to a good season with Bay Ferries and Mark MacDonald in 2016. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my question through you will be to the Minister of TIR. The news of the loss of the Little Narrows store reminded us all the importance of our provincial ferries. Last April, during question period, the minister said, "We will continue for the people of Englishtown and for all our 7 operations for the ferries of Nova Scotia to look at ways we can make improvements, increase safety and increase mobility." So my question for the minister is, what improvements, increases in safety and increases in mobility has the minister made for our ferries in the 7 months since he made that commitment?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. Obviously, the safety and the operation of our ferries in the province is of the utmost importance to the department. Our relationships with the local communities, with the local stakeholders who use those ferries is very significant. I've got tremendous faith in our department. We have ongoing conversations through Dan Leopold and John Makoyevich on those particular ferries. There are issues that have happened in the Narrows, as well as our other ferries that we operate. We're doing our very best, Mr. Speaker. There hadn't been any significant reports of major challenges on the whole with respect to our ferries for the season that's gone by. Certainly, there are daily conversations, Mr. Speaker, and we do our very best to improve those services and reach out to the stakeholders in the community and make things happen as we can. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, that was a great answer. Unfortunately, it didn't get anywhere close to the question. The fact of the matter is that the minister said that he was going to put commitments in place for the operation of the ferry to make improvements, increase safety and increase mobility. That was his commitment. It hasn't happened. Unfortunately, ferry service has an impact on the economy and the safety of all our communities that they serve. Fees for the ferries went up this year, but local residents have not seen a corresponding increase in reliability, and last winter Little Narrows and Englishtown ferries were closed. So, Mr. Speaker, we're down most of the time. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is this. Will the ferries in Little Narrows and Englishtown be running on a regular basis this winter?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, it's completely inaccurate to suggest that they were down most of the time. I know that the member understands that and knows better. That's absolutely not the case, first and foremost. They weren't down most of the time. honourable member. Secondly, with respect to safety, again, there haven't been major instances that I'm aware of that there's huge safety issues. Obviously, there's challenges with the service, Mr. Speaker, when there's ice in that area. We can't operate a cable ferry or a ferry service when the ice is blocking up the channel, Mr. Speaker. So I'm not sure what the member's getting at, but certainly we're doing our very best. If he has a specific situation or something he wants to bring to the floor of the House, then he can do so. We've done everything we can with respect to procedures, Mr. Speaker. We're doing our very best. We're working with the local community. If the member has something to bring it up, he can bring it up right here. Here I am. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. When a U.S. court ordered the seizure of the Nova Star on November the 1st after a complaint of an unpaid bill, neither the minister nor his department had received complaints concerning non-payment to Nova Scotia suppliers. Mr. Speaker, through you, since that date, has the minister been made aware of any outstanding bills owed to Nova Scotians by Nova Star?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. I was wondering how long it would take a member from the NDP caucus to get up and ask a question about the Yarmouth Ferry. I guess the wounds have healed, I guess, to a certain extent, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, we can bring in a mirror if the member wants to know where a lot of the challenges started with the service from Yarmouth to Portland, that's for sure. But I'll tell you, with respect to the question itself, Mr. Speaker, the answer is no. We haven't been contacted with respect to creditors in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne.
Well, thank you very much. The minister may be good at deflecting, but I'm good at asking questions. Mr. Speaker, Pat Melanson is the owner of the Piper's Gill. I'll repeat that, the Piper's Gill, and an entertainment company in Shelburne. He is owed $3,700. I'll repeat that too. $3,700 for 7 gigs aboard the Nova Star, from kitchen party cruises to Celtic shows. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, who is going to pay the piper?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
That was actually funny. I just caught that. No, that was pretty good. Look, Mr. Speaker, in all seriousness, the reality is that Nova Star had an agreement with the province of Nova Scotia for $13 million for this sailing season. Mr. Speaker, every business that has a relationship, whether it be with government or in the private sector, has obligations that they have to fulfill, Mr. Speaker. Nova Star has creditors based on the season, maybe from 2014, maybe from 2015. That's not our place. They're not our responsibility, Mr. Speaker. As a private sector entity, Nova Star has those duties to its creditors, and they've signaled that they will be honouring those bills that are outstanding. And, Mr. Speaker, at this point, we're moving on to 2016 with Mark McDonald and Bay Ferries. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister responsible for tourism. The Minister's Department recently awarded a $6 million tourism marketing contract to the Toronto arm of a national agency, DDB. DDB was awarded the contract over other Nova Scotia companies. This is the first time tourism marketing will be overseen by an out-of-province company. Will the minister provide a breakdown of just how much of the $6 million in tourism marketing dollars will be spent on the Nova Scotia companies, such as DDB's local partner, Trampoline, and how much will be actually sent out of the province?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. I don't have the numbers available with me, but certainly prepared to access those numbers and share them with my colleague.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to receiving those answers. We have a very skilled and knowledgeable tourism labour force right here in Nova Scotia. Organizations like Destination Eastern and Northumberland Shores have been doing an excellent job working right here in Nova Scotia, but their funding was cut by $60,000. What does the minister have to say to organizations like Dean's that have seen their funding cut, while millions of dollars is sent out of province to a Toronto company to market Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 2 points that my colleague raises are absolutely 2 separate discussions. The need for Nova Scotia, consistent with the Ivany report, to transform and double our tourism revenues, takes a particular strategy that's focused on marketing. At the local level, Mr. Speaker, the need for communities and individuals to identify ways of promoting local communities through 51 municipal VICs is a reasonable approach to take, and an approach that we'll continue to advance as government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Spring Hill has been in need of a new elementary school for many years, Mr. Speaker, to replace the old West End Elementary and Junction Road elementary schools. For the past 2 years, the Schenectady Regional School Board has identified a new elementary school for Spring Hill as a top priority on their capital construction list, and I will table that for the benefit of the House. I'd like to ask the Minister simply, will the Minister follow the priority list of the school board and assure Spring Hillers that they will get funding for a new elementary school this year?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. I think it's important as we look at requests that come in from school boards for either new construction or for additions and alterations that we have the complete picture. And I think that the good people in Spring Hill need to know the whole story. They need to know that in 2008, there was a request of the government of the day for a new school, and the government of the day said no, and additions and alterations is the best option. In 2010, there was a request to the NDP government, and the answer was the same. In 2013, 2014, to a Liberal government, the question was asked, the same answer. The people in Spring Hill need to know, and they do know, that a renovation can certainly provide a safe learning environment for kids, and that's what's been recommended by 3 different governments on 4 different occasions for the people in Spring Hill.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure you and all members of this House that what the people of Spring Hill know is that they have 2 elementary schools where the condition has deteriorated so much that rain actually falls onto the gym floor and throughout both schools. That the gyms in both schools are so small that the ability to deliver standard programming to the children of Spring Hill has become affected. Mr. Speaker, that's why 652 parents in Spring Hill have signed a petition calling on the government to provide 1 new school to replace the 2 old schools. Mr. Speaker, the Schenectady Central Regional School Board has put a new school for Spring Hill on their priority list. I'd like to ask the Minister, when will she tell the people of Spring Hill that they're going to get the 1 new school that their own school board has asked for?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure what part of my previous answer the member did not understand, but the question about a new school has been received by 3 different levels of 3 different governments of 3 different political parties, and every one of them, when those requests were assessed, were told that you have an option to do an A&A, take one of the elementary schools, make sure that it is safe, make sure that it can deliver a program for kids, and if the people in Spring Hill look at the junior senior high school, where between $8 and $9 million has just gone in to provide them a great renovation. So it can be done, it's in their own community, and I'd love to talk to the people of Spring Hill and explain that to them.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. The Minister told reporters that the Victoria General Hospital was just about back to 100% on services requirements and bed capacity. But the Operations Director, Victoria Sullivan, disagreed with the Minister, telling CBC that we're not back at 100%. We're at a reduced bed capacity. The level of service that we can provide is different, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, why didn't the Minister of Health know the actual situation at the VG before speaking to the media?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to convey to the honourable member that I was referring to, of course, the intensive care requirements, because that's what, in fact, allows for surgeries to be able to take place. Surgical capacity had been restored, and that was the area that I was referencing. In terms of, I was very clear in pointing out that the eye centre was at 70% capacity, with some of the 30 being picked up at the Cobequid Health Centre.
The The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, on October 8th, the Minister of Health promised regular updates on the damage from the flood at the VG. But the Minister's first and only update 4 weeks later, on November 8th, the Minister's information contradicted the operational directors. And there was no inventory of the damage the flood caused, details on the loss of intensive care capacity, or how they are coping with the reduction in beds. So I'd like to ask the Minister, when are we going to see a regular, comprehensive update on the impact the flood had on our health services?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the honourable member knows, we really should be celebrating the outstanding work carried out by staff at the time of the flood. Since then, there have been tremendous strides taken to increase and get the bed capacity up by opening the ninth floor. By opening space at the old VG. Yes, we did talk about giving regular updates. I know that the Nova Scotia Health Authority is also part of regular updating around operations, and this Thursday we will provide some additional update on what's taking place.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. Thursday, I asked about how the government handles freedom of information records from private email, PINs, and so forth. She committed to get back to the House. Does the Minister have an update?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. I don't have an update as yet.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, following question period, I received a letter on behalf of Commissioner Tully, the province's Information and Privacy Commissioner, which I'll table. It says that PINs, BBMs, private email, and so forth must be retained in accordance with the appropriate government retention policy set out in the Government Retention Records Act. The letter goes on to say the use of private email raises a number of concerns under FOIPOP and the Government Records Act, including privacy, protection of records, and retention of records. I'm just wondering how the Minister responds to those concerns.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Speaker, and that is certainly something that I will get back to the member about as I learn more myself. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. As the Minister knows, the campaign to raise $8 million for the hospice is now complete, and the announcement to build has been expected for 2 years now. And I know there have been other announcements in the Valley and Kingston and Digby since then about other projects. The Valley community anxiously awaits that build announcement. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is this: when will construction on the hospice in Kentville begin?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to inform the member that the MOU now, in terms of the frame, I need to go back and say the framework has now gone forward. There are 2 sites that are looking at a hospice, Halifax and the Valley. MOUs are now in discussion with the Valley and possibly with Halifax as well. And that's now what will determine the construction date will be when that MOU is signed off.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. My part of the project, Mr. Speaker, was for dialysis, and this is badly needed in the Valley. Currently, a patient on dialysis would spend 4 to 6 hours 3 times a week in Halifax. A friend of mine needing dialysis was told by healthcare providers that he should consider moving to Halifax. My question for the Minister: when can we expect dialysis services at Valley Regional, and where will they be housed?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That's a very, very good question. As the 2 projects had moved to be incorporated into one build, that, of course, is not possible because of the requirements with attaching the hospice to the Valley Regional. The dialysis final design under the provincial renal program is just about complete, and the Valley community and the Foundation should be hearing very shortly where that project is. Monies have started to be budgeted for that project.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia needs a new hospital to replace the Centennial Building. That much is very clear. But I'm concerned that the Health Minister floated a trial balloon on the Rick House show on September 29th on the idea of a public-private partnership to build this hospital. In Nova Scotia, the Auditor General reports found P3 schools had cost $52 million more over the life of the leases than it would have been if they would have been built publicly and owned by the province from the start. So I'd like to ask the Minister, will the Minister of Health tell us if the new hospital will be built under the P3 model?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what we can say so far in terms of planning is that there will be a distributed model of facilities. We have capacity in Truro, for example. We know that the Dartmouth project will create 46 beds, an ICU, a surgical tower with 8 theatres. So in many ways, some of the capacity required from the Centennial and the VG is already underway. Looking at private partnerships, such as we see at Scotia Surgery, have served this province very well.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, last December, Ontario's Auditor General warned the government that Infrastructure Ontario could demonstrate no value for the extra $8 billion it spent to procure 74 infrastructure projects via public-private partnership rather than the traditional public methods, Mr. Speaker. 30% overrun. Auditor Generals in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and the RCMP in Quebec have raised concerns about P3 projects for schools and hospitals, Mr. Speaker. Given that public-private partnership projects have been criticized by Auditor Generals across the country, why is the Minister considering building a P3 hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As any Nova Scotian takes a look at the financial situation of our province, we know that we must look at all the options, put them on the table. There is no commitment at this stage one way or another. We know that when we pay for a procedure at Scotia Surgery, we pay less than what we would in the public system.
The Honourable Member for Colchester-Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is for the Minister of Energy. The Alton gas storage facility in my constituency has caused a lot of discussion and raised many concerns. And I periodically meet with the manager whenever he is in Stewiacke from Calgary to discuss what some of these concerns are. And I will always end the discussion by saying, what have you heard from the government? And he says nothing. So I guess I'm going to ask the Minister of Energy if she could give an update on what is happening with the permits for Alton Gas.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can advise is that there were some concerns which had been raised by the Aboriginal community regarding some of the studies that had been undertaking and some additional avenues that they wanted to have looked at. We funded an additional study based on the concerns that they had raised, which the Aboriginal community was part of those consultations. Department of Energy staff and Department of Natural Resources staff, as well as staff from Aboriginal Affairs, have been working very closely with our Aboriginal community to address all of their concerns. My understanding is that those discussions are proceeding very efficiently, and we do hope to be able to provide an update on this project very shortly.
The Honourable Member for Colchester-Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to ask the Minister of Energy if he could make contact with the manager, David Burkett, and let him know what the plan is in the near future.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
I don't mind doing that, but I can advise the honourable member I did better than that. I met with the parent company up in Calgary and gave them an update as to the project, and they were quite pleased with how discussions were going, and we're looking forward to seeing this project move forward once all of the concerns have been properly addressed. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health. In recent months, we've been receiving many phone calls in our office about the shortage of doctors for people in the Cape Breton area. There's a walk-in clinic in Sydney at Health Park, and as recently as yesterday, if you were to walk in there, you had to sit on the floor in order to be able to get space. Mr. Speaker, even in an Angel clinic, you have to get phone 2 weeks in advance to try and get an appointment. People in our area are concerned about not having a family doctor. So my question to the Minister is quite simple. What is his party and his government doing to alleviate the shortage of family doctors in the Cape Breton area?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in the area that the member addresses and speaks about, there is a shortage of GPs, family practice clinicians, and we know that the Nova Scotia Health Authority will be carrying out recruitment throughout this year, and as the residents graduate, we certainly hope to fill some of those vacancies that are currently in Cape Breton.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for his answer. The question on many people's minds is, has this Minister have any thoughts of doing more to increase nurse practitioners so they would be able to be there to meet the needs of many people on Cape Breton Island when GPs cannot be obtained?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for being very progressive in thinking about the expanded role of the NPs and nurse practitioners. One of the real challenges.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers have expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 118, the Heritage Property Act?
We'll now call Bill number 118, the Heritage Property Act, amended. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, I introduced in the House of Assembly amendments to Nova Scotia's Heritage Property Act. Nova Scotians have a rich history, and we enjoy many provincial heritage properties that proudly stand in our communities. The proposed amendments will improve the Act and will help to protect important pieces of our heritage. Nova Scotia now has 287 registered provincial heritage properties, including the most recent